what we would really like them to do is to be honest about it and don't overinflate that number so that you have a steady flow over the coming decades. Every clear-cut tree contributes to drought and flood.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Houghton, and I'm with the Boundary Forest Watershed Stewardship Society. And I'm here with Ray Hanson, a board member with the group. And today we're going to talk about the Allowable Annual Cut, the AAC, and how this calculation rules the forests in BC and why it's such a problem for ecosystems, hydrological function, and the people living in the Kettle River watershed, as well as other areas in BC. There is evidence that the information that was used to determine the AAC for the boundary timber supply area was miscalculated. This means that the logging that's taken place there over the past 10 years was higher than even the BC government has determined as sustainable. And that was never corrected, and there's no indication that they're working on correcting it now. And just one of the many reasons why this is important is the big flood that happened in Grand Forks in 2018. It was labeled catastrophic by the BC government. Over 400 homes and many businesses, farms, and ranches were damaged, and the costs for the flood are well over 100 million. All right, so welcome, Ray. Thanks so much for taking on this discussion. Can you start by sharing a little about your forestry background?
Well, I started out in the BC Forest Service as a forest technician for about 12 years and eventually moved into a managerial position as a deputy ranger. And then, of course, we had the reorg where the ranger stations were done away with for local uh, contact and communication and went to the larger forest district. At that point, I became a forest resource manager, uh, and I remained in that position for about 20 years, serving in Queen Charlotte Islands and here in Grand Forks, or the Boundary Forest District. So I have a fair amount of experience in resource management, covering all aspects, sort of from tree planting, firefighting, range use, timber harvesting, just the whole gamut, inventory, and that kind of thing. So I'm fairly well versed, although it's been a few years since I retired, but I can still understand most of what's going on.
Yeah,
So,
that's excellent. And uh, our group, our citizens group, is lucky to have you. There are a lot of citizens groups like ours across BC. There's over 100 of them. I think there's probably close to 200 groups in British Columbia at this point that are working to address the negative impacts of industrial forestry in their regions. And not everybody is lucky enough to have somebody who has your knowledge and background. So thank you for turning your knowledge towards making a difference for our watershed. So I'm just going to give a little bit more background about the AAC, and then maybe if you could tell us just exactly what that means. So
okay.
forest management and forestry legislation in BC have as their priority the potential flow of raw logs out of the forest, aka the timber supply. So the allowable annual cut determinations are made by the Ministry of Forests, and that controls the maximum rate of cut. So when it comes to determining the AAC, the primary consideration has always been the flow of timber, and all other non-timber values are considered constraints on the timber supply. Since the early 2000s to the current day, as natural forests have been cut down, there's been a simultaneous increase in the area of BC forests impacted by fires, insects, and disease. So this has meant a further decline in the amount of commercial timber in the province. However, the provincial AAC, including the AAC in the boundary timber supply area, has not always been reduced to account for these unplanned losses. So can you tell us a little bit more exactly what the allowable annual cut is?
Well, on the within the province, of course, you've got whatever it is, 92% of the province is crown land or whatever. And within that crown land, there are a number of forest harvesting tenures. And like, say, a tree farm license or a woodlot license or a community forest license, those are land-based tenures that generate their own annual allowable cut based on their land base within the timber supply area. So they are sort of set aside with their own AAC based on their particular land base. So the rest of the area is divided up into temporary tenures that are put out to licensees to harvest from. And within, say, for instance, the Boundary TSA, certain harvesters have operational areas that they can work in within the TSA. And when after the chief forester makes a determination of the annual allowable cut, the amount of timber that they can cut each year, that is doled out to these licenses that these people have. And so they can harvest up to and including an annual allowable cut, plus they're allowed in most cases to go to a 5-year average. So they can harvest a bit more or a bit less in the 5-year period, but they're obligated to balance out within the 5-year period. And of course, that is tied to their tenure, which may be a forest license or temporary. There are such things as temporary licenses. So anyway, the whole idea is that the Forest Service assesses the forest cover, as you mentioned earlier, which means it's got to take into account all the areas that have been harvested, all the areas that have been burned, and any other kind of disturbance where there might have been blowdown or there might have been insects and disease have devastated portions of the forest. Anyway, they have to net all that down so that they can look at how much forest is still available to harvest into the future. And of course, in the case of replanted areas or areas that have regenerated, they are assigned a certain amount of value in terms of the future according to their age and size. So they get counted in, but of course, in most cases, they're not available for several decades. So you can net in a certain amount from that, but it takes a long while to pick up a big volume from the already harvested areas, because you're looking at 80 to say 120 years to grow a good tree for harvesting and making milling lumber or whatever. Anyway, so the chief forester and their staff, they look at all this stuff through mainly through computerized stuff now, and they have programs and so on to sort through it all. And a lot of it should be based on field studies or field reports that have confirmed the accuracy and viability of their data. And then they then come up with what is usually called a base case. In other words, they put all of this information into a program and they tweak the program to respond to telling them how much volume is out there to be that can be used over the future. And so in the last in 2013 and 14, there was a reassessment done. And at that point,
of the boundary of the
of
just
the
the boundary.
boundary timber supply area, yeah, which is basically from Big White down to the U.S. border, from Anarchus towards Osoyoos, and then up on top of the Paulson between Christina Lake and Castlegar. So anyway, back to 2013 and 14, they did this reassessment. But when the chief forester made the determination, in other words, she looks at all of this, the base case, and any adjustments they might have made to the base case, either restricting a bit more or loosening up a bit more on what the volume comes out to be. In her determination at that time, she set an AAC around 700,000 cubic meters, which was above what the program they're using told them was available into the future by probably 100,000 or more cubic meters, which in reality meant that she then divvies that number up to the forest licensees, and they're harvesting then more wood than is growing back. Yeah, so she chose at that time to allocate out more available timber to be harvested than should be, because if you harvest it now, because the trees take, as I said earlier, 80 to 120 years to grow, then you're eating up the future. And so they call that a future Falldown effect. In other words, you may end up, in the case of the 2014 determination, you may end up with 2 or 3 decades or more where your volume has to fall way down to make up for that shortage. So then that puts your economy of your community and the surrounding area in jeopardy for timber supply and milling wood and that kind of thing. So what we would really like them to do is to be honest about it and don't overinflate that number so that you have a steady flow over the coming decades. This way, you're going to have ups and downs, which will mean variations and of employment and the economy. And also, we don't know what the future looks like in terms of climate change. So we should be putting some cautionary principle to work there, so that if things get worse, as they appear that they could at this time, then we have a bit of a cushion to work with.
Is there any indication why a chief forester would do that? Like what would motivate a chief forester to allocate more timber than there is to be cut?
Well, the short answer probably is the chief forester has to assess the economic aspect of it as well. And of course, the chief forester works for the Minister of Forest, and the Minister of Forest works for the Premier and the Cabinet. So there's probably lots of pressure to keep employment numbers up and mill capacities up and those kinds of things. So unfortunately, I guess, although the chief forester probably would deny any pressure from the political side, obviously that would appear to be what the problem is, that you don't have a truly independent person making this decision and um, being separated. Problem is with governments, they're all in a 3 to 5 year term or window. And so they're not looking down the road 100 years or 80 years or 60 years or whatever, which is really unfortunate because with forestry, that's really what you need to do.
So short-term political considerations, like very, very short-term political
Yeah,
considerations, making the job numbers and the harvesting numbers look good during their time in office
yeah,
is it seems like might be influencing things rather than uh, BC economy, jobs in the long run, and especially not ecosystems. So
in
yeah,
the
so the AA, go ahead.
in the case of our timber supply here, the 2024 is supposed to be the redo of the timber or the AAC timber supply area, and I did contact the analysis branch in Victoria last year, and was told in June, or was told before June, that they would have this data package ready in June. Now the data package is all the stuff that they're using to come up with a recommended AAC. So generally, they release that to the public so that people can see what their calculations are and how they've made them and so on and so forth, so that people who want to know that can have access to it before the determination is made. So anyway, I was told in a communication that we would see this data package. Well, I communicated a couple of times more after, and now I've been told it's not coming out this year, even though I was told the data package was to be completed in June. And the reason they're falling back on is First Nations consultation, which I think has become a bit of a maintenance of status quo for the government to use that excuse. No one's denying that the for First Nations shouldn't be consulted on these things, but it just seems like you're going to put off this assessment for another couple of years, which means you're going to maintain the same rate of cut over that couple of years and eat away more of the material that would be available in the future. And I don't think any First Nations band is going to object to having the thing looked at and come out with something and run it by them after that before you make the determination. And they're not going to object if it shrinks a bit, I'm sure. But anyway, that's kind of where we're at, is the government is choosing to put this off. Of course, we know there's an election in the fall. That would make one wonder if maybe there isn't some connection there. But anyway,
Yeah,
that's kind of where we're at.
and they have known, for 10 years, it was, they've been saying the next AAC determination would be 2024. So it's
Right,
not like suddenly they were surprised that they had to do Indigenous consultation. They've known this for 10 years and they've
right.
chosen to put it off or to use it as an excuse. So, and our group has been going to the government. You've been writing letters to them about this. Our group has been writing letters. We've created a 2020 report with all of this information. We made recommendations. In 2009, the BC government Forest Inventory Branch indicated that the modeling for the Boundary TSA overestimated stand volume by approximately 20%. In 2018, two forestry experts, Britniff and Watts, put out a report indicating that the inventory that the AAC is based on is, quote, based on photographic interpretations between 1954 and 2009, with the majority occurring in the late 1980s, end quote. So they're using old information. Do you think that the information has been updated? Like, let's say they do get around to finally doing a reassessment. What kind of information are they going to be looking at this time around?
Well, certainly the information technology has, increased remarkably with the introduction of LIDAR and different other technologies. So there really is not a big excuse to be using old data. And yeah, so it's strange to me that they had this uh, package ready last June, and now they're saying they're not going to move forward with it for at least a couple of years. So it's really strange that this kind of thing is happening.
So, in one of our recommendations in our 2020 report was that the Boundary TSA AAC must immediately be reduced by at least 30% to bring it to what the province considers to be a sustainable level. Do you agree with that? Like, that was 4 years ago we made that recommendation. Is 30% still the accurate number,
Yes, I would say
appropriate number?
somewhere in the 20 to 30% would be an appropriate number. Yeah.
And when they're determining the AAC, does the chief forester look at anything else other than volumes and timber supply? Do they consider biodiversity, ecosystem function, hydrology, grizzly bear populations?
Well, in theory, they probably would say they do, but we don't know that any kind of strong data relating to those areas gets put into the mix as far as the database goes. Now, um, they do have people who presumably would look at what's being offered or suggested and make recommendations, but we don't necessarily see that through the determination report that the chief forester writes. They may talk about some issues like pests or fires or other more serious or bigger issues, but they don't necessarily talk about you know wildlife or fisheries or hydrology or that kind of thing, which is becoming more and more important with the future prospects of climate change and droughts and floods and forest fires.
Yeah, massive losses of primary forests in BC have led to increases in fires and drought and floods. And you'd think that the government would take that into
Yeah.
consideration moving forward. It seems like a lot of the area in the Kettle River watershed in the Boundary TSA, a lot of the forests are very young. It seems like most of them, maybe a large percentage of them, anyways, would be under 40 years. Just in your opinion, in your estimation, what age are a lot of the forests in the boundary? A lot of them have been cut, so they're fairly young.
Well, the clear cutting probably started in the late 60s, early 70s. And so if you go back, 50 years or whatever, 50, 60 years, that's when some of your clear cut stands probably were established. And so, they would be the oldest. And uh, yeah, so that's still, a ways away from providing good merchantable logs.
So some of the other recommendations that we made in our report in 2020 were to immediately undertake a study to determine how much to further reduce the AAC in the boundary to bring the ecosystem back to a functioning state, and to mandate the use of most recent technologies such as LiDAR and up-to-date information to calculate inventory. And we were also recommending that forests in the boundary must no longer be logged faster than they can grow back.
Right.
Do you, are there any other recommendations at this point that are critical to be taken into consideration on the AAC?
Well, I guess um, a lot of the regrowth of the forest is going to depend on how the climate goes over the next few decades. And if it continues to warm and dry, that will be particularly a problem here in the boundary because we are fairly warm and dry to begin with. And if we get warmer and drier, then your regrowth of your forest is going to slow down. We've already seen some effect on some cedar trees where, in a normal year in the past, they might get a little bit of what we call flagging. Some of the branches, a few intermittent branches may be turning red or something. But now we're seeing a lot more of that where they're either turning very red, a greater portion is turning red, or the tree is not able to keep up with the water demand. And so we're seeing cedar in particular being affected that way. And no doubt other species will, have problems as well if we get much warmer and drier.
So, is there anything else that you think that we need to cover in regards to either AAC determinations in general or the boundary AAC 2024 determination? What's happening in the boundary around the AAC right now?
Well, one issue for us here in the boundary is low flows, low stream flows in the summer, like in the Kettle and the Granby especially. And unfortunately, in the last AAC determination, the chief forester encouraged the licensees to go into higher elevations to harvest more in higher elevations and not just in the low valley bottoms or mid slope areas. Unfortunately, that is not a good scenario now because your higher elevations are where you're going to retain snow and water much longer into the season. So hopefully, when they do redo that, they will bring the limit of logging down slope a bit more so as to preserve the function of those higher elevation forests for hydrology. And also, as we know here in the boundary, we have some white bark pine, and we would like to make sure that it doesn't get wiped out because it's a food source for grizzly bears and squirrels and also the Clark's nutcracker. And so we would like to see in the new assessment where they take into consideration uh, staying out of those high elevation stands.
One of our other recommendations in our report was that the government mandate baseline hydrological assessments in all watersheds within the Kettle River watershed before any new logging can take place. The assessments must determine if logging has contributed to increases in the frequency, duration, and magnitude of peak flows, increased sediment transport, and how it may contribute to further severe flooding events, and if so, pause or decrease logging accordingly. Have you seen that the government is doing hydrological assessments? And does the chief forester look at hydrological assessments when determining the AAC? Is that included at all?
I'm not sure whether, yeah, whether that's included. I'd have to go back and read that report again, but the one from 2014, which is available for people to look at and review online if you simply go into British Columbia timber supply areas and choose the boundary timber supply, you can see the last determination. But yeah, I would assume that any hydrological information would come out in some form that would affect how the trees were growing or something like that, rather than an actual hydrologic assessment type thing. At least from the past, I don't think it's been prominent in the decision.
Okay, so we've got a difficult road ahead of us. Those of us who want to see changes made to the way industrial forestry is practiced in British Columbia. Like mentioned before, you've written numerous letters to our MLAs, to the district manager in our region of the forestry ministry. Our group produced this report. We presented it to government. It doesn't really feel like anybody's listening in government, and they're just plowing ahead. Business as usual, talk and log. And so what we're doing is what the Boundary Forest Watershed Stewardship Society is doing is we're coming up with a plan, a strategy to make change, to make things different. So we're joining forces with other groups in British Columbia like ours. And the campaign is called The Power of Forests. And we're aiming to get politicians to listen to us, because as individual groups, what's happening across the province is they're not listening to us. They're not listening to groups. They're not listening to individuals. They're not paying any attention to the science and the data that shows the damage that's happening in ecosystem, that demonstrates the increases in floods. And so we want to make our voices louder. And so the Power of Forests project is aimed at joining forces so that the government will listen. Our project is on our website at boundaryforest.org. And we'd love for anyone listening to join and support us in any way you can. We will be doing events across the province in September and October of this year. And the more the merrier. The more that join us, the stronger we'll be. Thank you so much, Ray, for sharing all of your expertise with us today. Was there anything you'd like to add before we sign off?
Just that every clear-cut tree contributes to drought and flood. I'll leave it at that.